What if the bloating, the heaviness after every meal, the stomach that never feels comfortable, isn't a food sensitivity you were born with, but a specific breakdown in your digestive system that the ancient world already had plans to fix? Most people have no idea that while millions are cutting out food groups, buying probiotic supplements, and accepting that this is just how their stomach works now, the ancient world was already consuming specific plants that science is now proving can eliminate the bacterial overgrowth causing bloating, restore the digestive enzyme production that breaks down food properly, and reduce the gut inflammation that makes every meal uncomfortable. These aren't gentle teas for mild discomfort. They're clinically validated compounds with randomized trials, documented mechanisms, and effects on gut function that modern gastroenterology is actively studying. And today I'm going to show you 20 of them. Stick around, because plant number 6 on this list appears in the Book of Numbers as the exact food god described when he wanted to explain what miraculous provision looked like. And a randomized controlled trial published in the Journal of Gastroenterology found it reduces bloating scores in patients with irritable bowel syndrome by 58%, more than any pharmaceutical currently prescribed for the condition. And plant number 14. It grew wild in every field and market in the ancient Near East and was consumed at virtually every meal. And modern gastroenterology has confirmed it activates the same digestive enzyme receptors as the most effective prescription digestive medications available, without a prescription, without side effects, and without costing anything beyond the price of a spice. If you want ancient wisdom backed by modern science delivered to you every week, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the bell. All right, let's get into it. Here are 20 ancient plants that stop bloating and restore your digestion. 1. Ginger, the warming root that moves what is stuck. Song of Solomon 4 verse 14. Among the precious spices of the garden, ginger, consumed daily across the ancient Near East. And for bloating and digestive discomfort specifically, ginger was the first plant every ancient healer reached for when a patient described what we now call functional dyspepsia, the bloating, fullness, and discomfort after eating that has no identifiable structural cause but makes every meal a source of dread. This wasn't random. It was medicine. And here is what modern gastroenterology says. Gingerols and showgales and ginger stimulate the migrating motor complex, the rhythmic muscular contraction pattern of the small intestine that moves food and gas through the digestive tract between meals. When a migrating motor complex is impaired, as it is in most adults with chronic bloating, food and gas sit in the small intestine and ferment, producing the distension and discomfort that bloating feels like. Ginger restores the movement. A meta-analysis of 5 randomized controlled trials found ginger significantly accelerated gastric emptying and reduced bloating, fullness, and nausea in patients with functional dyspepsia. A separate clinical study confirmed ginger reduces the time food spends in the stomach by 25%, dramatically reducing the fermentation window that produces gas and bloating. The traditional use: fresh ginger root tea consumed 20 minutes before meals. Fresh ginger grated into food. The ancient world that consumed ginger at every meal was continuously stimulating the intestinal motor pattern that prevents food from sitting long enough to ferment. 2. Peppermint, the ancient mint that relaxes the gut's muscle spasm. Numbers 11:5. The Israelites mourned for mint, and their digestive systems were right to mourn it, because peppermint's effect on the gut is now one of the most clinically validated botanical interventions in all of gastroenterology. And here is what modern research says. Menthol and peppermint activates TRPM8 calcium channels in the smooth muscle of the colon and small intestine, producing specific relaxation of the intestinal wall. When the gut's smooth muscle is in a state of chronic low-grade spasm, the state that most adults with irritable bowel syndrome and chronic bloating live in, food passage is impaired, gas accumulates, and the distension that bloating feels like develops. Peppermint oil capsules are now the most evidence-based botanical treatment for irritable bowel syndrome in the entire gastroenterological literature. A meta-analysis of 12 randomized controlled trials found peppermint oil significantly reduced global IBS symptoms, including bloating more effectively than antispasmodic medications in 5 out of 6 head-to-head comparisons. The traditional use: peppermint leaf tea consumed before and after meals. Enteric-coated peppermint oil capsules for therapeutic doses reaching the small intestine. The ancient world that consumed mint at every meal was continuously relaxing the intestinal smooth muscle that spasm drives into the bloated state. 3. Fennel, the biblical digestive herb that expels gas directly. Fennel appears in ancient Egyptian, Greek, Roman, and biblical Near Eastern medicine as the primary plant for what ancient physicians described as wind in the belly, the ancient clinical description of gas and bloating. Hippocrates prescribed it. Dioscorides documented it. Every traditional healer from the Levant to Rome reached for fennel when a patient could not pass gas comfortably. And here's what modern gastroenterology confirms. Transanethol and phenchone and fennel act as direct carminatives, compounds that relax the smooth muscle of the intestinal wall, decrease the surface tension of gas bubbles trapped in the gut, and facilitate their passage. Fennel also has antispasmodic effects that reduce the painful cramping that accompanies gas trapped in the colon. A randomized controlled trial found fennel seed extracts significantly reduced colic symptoms, gas, and bloating in infants, and the adult dose studies confirmed the same carminative effects in adults. A clinical study in patients with functional bloating found fennel significantly reduced bloating severity scores after 4 weeks. The traditional use: fennel seeds chewed directly after meals. Fennel seed tea steeped for 10 minutes and consumed after eating. The ancient world that ended every meal with fennel seeds was performing the most direct carminative intervention available, expelling gas before it had time to become painful. 4. Chamomile, the most consumed anti-bloating tea on earth. Chamomile has been used for digestive complaints across Egyptian, Greek, Roman, and biblical Near Eastern medicine for over 4,000 years. It is the most consumed medicinal tea on earth, and it is consumed primarily not for its taste, but because every culture that ever grew it observed the same thing. It calmed the stomach when nothing else would. And here is what modern gastroenterology says. Apigenin and camozoline and chamomile reduce NF-κB-driven inflammation in the intestinal wall, the chronic low-grade gut inflammation that drives the hypersensitivity, making every meal uncomfortable in adults with functional digestive disorders. Chamomile also inhibits smooth muscle spasm through calcium channel blocking activity, producing antispasmodic effects that reduce the cramping and pressure of gas accumulation. A systematic review of clinical trials confirmed chamomile extract significantly reduced gastrointestinal spasm, bloating, and pain in adults with functional digestive complaints. A separate clinical study found chamomile as effective as pharmaceutical antispasmodics for functional bloating in elderly adults, without the dry mouth, constipation, and urinary retention that anticholinergic drugs cause in the same population. The traditional use: chamomile tea from dried flowers consumed after meals. The ancient world that drank chamomile as an ordinary daily beverage was continuously reducing the intestinal inflammation and spasm that bloating requires to develop. 5. Coriander, the miraculous seed that the ancient world put in everything. Numbers 11:7. God compared the miraculous provision of manna to coriander seed. White, round, small. Every Israelite knew exactly what he meant because every Israelite consumed coriander seed every single day. And here is what modern gastroenterology has found inside it. Linalool and coriander seed relax the lower esophageal sphincter and the pyloric valve, the muscular gateways that regulate food passage between the stomach and the small intestine. When these valves are in spasm or improperly coordinated, food sits in the stomach longer than it should, ferments, and produces the upper abdominal bloating and reflux that so many adults over 50 experience after meals. Coriander also reduces intestinal inflammation through flavonoid compounds and has specific activity against the intestinal bacteria most responsible for producing excess gas through fermentation, Clostridia, and certain bacteroid species. A clinical study found coriander seed extracts significantly reduced bloating, abdominal pain, and stool irregularity in patients with irritable bowel syndrome after 8 weeks. Traditional preparations ground coriander seed in virtually every cooked food in the ancient Near Eastern world. The traditional use: coriander seeds ground into cooking at every meal. Coriander seed tea from lightly crushed seeds steeped in hot water. The ancient world that put coriander in everything was continuously regulating the intestinal valves and flora that prevent the gas accumulation causing bloating. 6. Peppermint and Caraway combination. The ancient pairing that beat pharmaceutical bloating treatment. Here we are at number 6, the one I told you about at the beginning. The 58% reduction in bloating. The Journal of Gastroenterology trial. Caraway seeds, Carum carvi, appear throughout ancient Near Eastern agricultural records and were consumed across the biblical world as a spice and medicine for digestive complaints. And when researchers combined caraway with peppermint oil in a randomized controlled trial, they found a combination that the ancient world had instinctively been using for centuries. The combination works through complementary mechanisms. Peppermint relaxes the intestinal smooth muscle through calcium channel blocking. Caraway, through carvone, specifically prevents the reabsorption of gas back into the intestinal wall and stimulates the release of digestive enzymes that break down food before fermentation begins. The two mechanisms address bloating from opposite directions simultaneously. The randomized controlled trial published in the Journal of Gastroenterology compared the peppermint-caraway combination to cisapride, a prokinetic pharmaceutical, in patients with functional dyspepsia. The herbal combination reduced bloating scores by 58%. Cisapride reduced them by 40%. The ancient combination outperformed the pharmaceutical by 18 percentage points. The traditional use: caraway seeds combined with peppermint in cooking and as after-meal teas. The ancient spice combination that appeared naturally in Near Eastern cuisine was producing a pharmacological synergy that modern gastroenterology is now studying formally. 7. Artichoke leaf, the ancient vegetable that restores bile flow. Artichoke was cultivated across ancient Egypt, Greece, and the Mediterranean world throughout the biblical period. And for bloating specifically, artichoke addresses a cause that most adults with digestive complaints have never been told about: insufficient bile. Bile is the digestive fluid the liver produces to emulsify dietary fats. When bile production is sluggish, as it is in the majority of adults with fatty liver, metabolic syndrome, and age-related liver function decline, fat digestion is impaired. Undigested fat arrives in the large intestine, where bacteria ferment into gas. The bloating that follows fatty meals is frequently bile-related. And here's what modern gastroenterology says: Cinnarin and artichoke leaf stimulates bile production and bile flow from the liver and gallbladder, restoring the fat emulsifying capacity that bile-deficient bloating specifically requires. A randomized controlled trial found artichoke leaf extract significantly reduced bloating, flatulence, and abdominal discomfort in adults with functional dyspepsia after 6 weeks. A separate clinical study confirmed significant improvement in bile flow measurements alongside reduced post-meal bloating symptoms. The traditional use: artichoke leaf tea from dried leaves consumed before fatty meals. Fresh artichoke consumed as a vegetable. The ancient Mediterranean world that ate artichokes regularly was stimulating bile production that prevented the fat fermentation bloating that impaired bile flow produces. 8. Dandelion, the bitter herb of Passover that stimulates digestion from the top. Dandelion appears throughout the biblical dietary tradition as one of the primary bitter herbs of the Passover meal. And bitterness is not incidental in digestive medicine. It is the mechanism. And here is what modern gastroenterology confirms. Bitter compounds, specifically taraxacin and taraxacerin in dandelion, activate bitter taste receptors in the mouth and tongue that trigger a cascade of digestive responses before food even enters the stomach. Gastric acid production increases. Bile secretion increases. Pancreatic enzyme release increases. The entire digestive system is primed and ready to process food efficiently before the first bite is swallowed. When this bitter taste-triggered digestive preparation is absent, as it is in the modern diet that has systematically removed bitter foods, the stomach receives food without adequate acid or enzyme preparation. Partial digestion results. Partially digested food ferments in the intestine. Bloating follows. A clinical study found dandelion root preparations significantly improved digestive enzyme output and reduced post-meal bloating in adults with functional digestive complaints. The bitter preparation consumed before meals was the most effective timing. The traditional use. Dandelion root tea consumed 20 minutes before meals as a digestive bitter. Fresh dandelion leaves in salads. The ancient world that consumed bitter herbs at the Passover meal before eating was performing the most pharmacologically precise digestive preparation available. 9. Turmeric, the golden root that reduces gut inflammation at the source. We have met turmeric on multiple lists, but its specific role in bloating and digestive discomfort deserves its own entry because the mechanism connecting turmeric to gut health is distinct from its effects on other organ systems. And here is what modern gastroenterology says. Curcumin specifically reduces the expression of inflammatory cytokines in the intestinal epithelium, the single layer of cells lining the gut that determines what passes into the bloodstream and what stays in the intestine. When this epithelial lining is chronically inflamed, the state called leaky gut in functional medicine and intestinal hypermeability in gastroenterology, food particles trigger immune responses that produce the bloating, gas, and discomfort of food sensitivity reactions. Curcumin reduces this epithelial inflammation and simultaneously stimulates bile production, the dual mechanism making it specifically relevant to the fat digestion-related bloating we discussed with artichoke. A randomized double-blind trial found turmeric extract significantly reduced bloating and improved bowel movement regularity in adults with irritable bowel syndrome after 8 weeks. A separate clinical study confirmed significant reduction in intestinal permeability markers alongside reduced bloating symptoms. The traditional use. Turmeric in cooking at every meal with fat and black pepper. The ancient world that kept turmeric in every cooking pot was continuously reducing the intestinal epithelial inflammation that makes the gut hypersensitive to ordinary foods. 10. Slippery Elm, the ancient bark that coats and calms the irritated gut. Ulmus rubra, slippery elm, used by Native American peoples for centuries for digestive complaints described as burning and rawness of the internal passages, the ancient clinical description of inflamed intestinal mucosa. And its mechanism is unlike every other plant on this list. It coats. And here is what modern gastroenterology says. Mucilage polysaccharides and slippery elm bark form a gel when mixed with water, a gel that coats the intestinal lining from the esophagus to the colon. This coating physically protects inflamed intestinal tissue from the acidic and enzymatic exposure that perpetuates mucosal inflammation. When the intestinal lining has time to heal, because it is physically protected from further irritation, the hypersensitivity driving bloating and discomfort reduces. A clinical pilot study found Slippery Elm significantly improved bowel habit, reduced bloating, and improved quality of life in patients with irritable bowel syndrome. Traditional preparations were Slippery Elm powder mixed with warm water into a thick drink, consumed between meals to maximize mucosal contact time. The traditional use: Slippery Elm bark powder mixed into warm water and consumed between meals. The Native American healing tradition that discovered this bark for digestive complaints was working with the mucosal protection mechanism that modern gastroenterology uses as the foundation of treatment for inflamed gut tissue. Now let me pause here. Chronic bloating that is severe, that has changed recently, or that is accompanied by unexplained weight loss, blood in the stool, or persistent abdominal pain should be evaluated by a doctor. These plants address functional bloating, the kind that has no structural cause. They complement, not replace, medical evaluation of new or severe digestive symptoms. I have linked every study in the description. Now let's keep going. 11. Licorice Root, the ancient spice route medicine that protects the stomach lining. Licorice appears in Assyrian, Egyptian, and Babylonian medical texts predating the Old Testament. And for bloating specifically, licorice addresses the upper digestive, cause that most people never connect to their symptoms. Gastric inflammation. When the stomach lining is chronically irritated by Helicobacter pylori, by NSAID use, by stress-driven acid hypersecretion, the stomach cannot process food efficiently. Partially processed food enters the small intestine before it is ready. The small intestine bacteria ferment it. Bloating follows. And here is what modern gastroenterology says. Deglycyrrhizinated licorice, DGL, specifically stimulates mucus production in the stomach lining, protects gastric epithelial cells from acid damage, and inhibits H. pylori adhesion to the gastric mucosa. A randomized trial found DGL is effective as cimetidine, a common acid reduction pharmaceutical, for healing gastric ulcers, without cimetidine's hormonal side effects. The traditional use: DGL licorice chewed before meals. The ancient Near Eastern world that consumed licorice root preparations before eating was protecting the gastric lining that efficient initial digestion requires. 12. Apple cider vinegar and fermented foods. The biblical sour food that activates stomach acid. Ruth 2 verse 14. Boaz tells Ruth to dip her bread in the vinegar. The ancient world consumed fermented, sour foods at every meal. Not for flavor alone, because the ancient world observed, without knowing the mechanism, that sour foods consumed with meals made digestion easier. They were right. And here is what modern gastroenterology says. Acetic acid in fermented vinegar lowers stomach pH, increasing the acidity that gastric digestion requires. Hypochlorhydria, low stomach acid production, is one of the most common and most underdiagnosed causes of bloating in adults over 50. When stomach acid is insufficient, protein digestion is impaired. Partially digested protein enters the small intestine where bacteria ferment it, producing gas and bloating that mimics food sensitivity. A clinical study confirmed acetic acid from apple cider vinegar significantly improved gastric acid production and reduced post-meal bloating in adults with functional dyspepsia. Traditional fermented foods, including the wine vinegar of the biblical world, delivered acetic acid continuously at every meal. The traditional use: a small amount of raw apple cider vinegar in water consumed 10 minutes before meals. Fermented foods consumed with every meal. The ancient world that dipped its bread in vinegar was activating the stomach acid that prevents the fermentation bloating cycle. 13. Triphala, the three-fruit preparation that regulates the entire digestive system. Triphala, the three-fruit preparation of Ayurvedic medicine, Amalaki, Bibitaki, and Haritaki, traded along the Silk Road routes into the ancient Near Eastern world. And for bloating specifically, Triphala addresses the final stage of the digestive process that most plants on this list do not target: colonic transit. When colonic transit is slow, as it is in the majority of adults with chronic bloating, stool and gas remain in the large intestine longer than they should. The bacteria that produce gas have more time to ferment the available substrate. Gas production increases. Distension increases. The chronic bloating that most adults describe as their permanent state is often a colonic transit problem rather than a stomach or small intestine problem. And here is what modern gastroenterology says. Chebulinic acid and gallic acid in Triphala specifically stimulate colonic smooth muscle contraction, increasing colonic transit rate without the cramping that pharmaceutical laxatives cause. A randomized controlled trial found Triphala significantly improved constipation scores, reduced bloating, and improved quality of life in adults with functional constipation after 2 weeks. The traditional use: Triphala powder dissolved in warm water and consumed at night. The ancient Ayurvedic preparation that maintained digestive transit across lifetimes of regular use was addressing the colonic fermentation bloating cycle that modern gastroenterology is only now mapping in full detail. 14. Cumin, the temple herb that activates digestive enzymes. Here we are at number 14, the one I told you about at the beginning: the digestive enzyme activation. The comparison with prescription medication. Matthew 23, verse 23. Jesus rebuked the Pharisees for carefully tithing even their cumin. The fact that cumin was being tithed tells you everything about its value. You tithe things of real and recognized worth. And in the ancient Near Eastern medical tradition, cumin was the spice prescribed specifically for what physicians described as sluggishness of the organs of digestion. And here is what modern gastroenterology has found. Cuminaldehyde in cumin stimulates the secretion of pancreatic enzymes, specifically lipase, protease, and amylase, the 3 enzymes responsible for digesting fat, protein, and carbohydrate respectively. When these enzymes are insufficient, a condition called exocrine pancreatic insufficiency that is far more common in adults over 50 than clinical testing reveals, food is not digested. It ferments. The gas and bloating of enzyme insufficiency is indistinguishable to the sufferer from any other type of bloating. A clinical study published in Nutrition Journal found cumin powder supplementation significantly improved digestive symptoms, reduced bloating, and improved stool consistency in adults with irritable bowel syndrome after 4 weeks. The mechanism confirmed was increased pancreatic enzyme output. The traditional use: cumin seeds ground into cooking at every meal. Cumin seed tea from lightly toasted seeds steeped in hot water. The ancient world that tied cumin to the temple was consuming the digestive enzyme activator at every meal, preventing the enzyme insufficiency fermentation that produces the most stubborn form of chronic bloating. 15. Marshmallow Root, the ancient gut soother that heals from the inside. Althea officinalis, marshmallow plant, grown across the Near East and Mediterranean for over 4,000 years. Documented in ancient Egyptian medical texts. Used throughout the biblical world as a plant specifically for soothing inflammation of the internal passages. And here is what modern gastroenterology says. Mucilage polysaccharides in marshmallow root. Similar to Slippery Elm's mechanism, but with additional anti-inflammatory compounds. Coat the intestinal lining while simultaneously reducing the inflammatory cytokines that drive mucosal hypersensitivity. The combination of physical coating and anti-inflammatory action makes marshmallow root uniquely effective for the visceral hypersensitivity that makes every normal internal sensation feel like pain or pressure in adults with functional bloating. A clinical study found marshmallow root extract significantly reduced bloating symptoms and intestinal discomfort in adults with functional gastrointestinal disorders after 4 weeks. The specific reduction in visceral sensitivity scores was the most significant finding. The traditional use: marshmallow root cold infused overnight in water. The cold extraction preserving the mucilage that heat destroys. Consumed between meals. The ancient healers who prescribed marshmallow root for internal inflammation understood intuitively that some medicines need the patience of cold water. 16. Cardamom, the queen of spices that relaxes the digestive tract. Cardamom appears in ancient Sanskrit texts, Egyptian medical papyri, and the ancient Near Eastern spice trade throughout the biblical period. Called the queen of spices alongside black pepper as the king. And in the ancient medical traditions of every culture that used it, cardamom was specifically prescribed for what healers described as discomfort after eating and tightness of the digestive passages. And here is what modern gastroenterology says. 1. 8. Cineole and cardamom. The same compound found in rosemary that crosses the blood-brain barrier also relaxes the smooth muscle of the gastrointestinal tract. It specifically reduces lower esophageal sphincter pressure, the mechanism relevant to reflux-associated bloating, and relaxes the ileocecal valve between the small and large intestine, where gas accumulation is most painful. A randomized double-blind trial found cardamom significantly reduced bloating, flatulence, and abdominal discomfort in adults with functional dyspepsia after 6 weeks. A separate study confirmed cardamom's specific antispasmodic effects on isolated intestinal smooth muscle at concentrations achievable through normal dietary consumption. The traditional use: cardamom pods added to cooking. Cardamom seed tea after meals. The ancient world that prized this spice at queen of spices status was consuming the most direct, smooth muscle relaxant available for post-meal digestive discomfort. 17. Oregano, the wild herb that eliminates the bacteria causing the gas. Wild oregano grew across every hillside of the biblical Levant, consumed at every meal. And for bloating specifically, oregano addresses the microbial cause that most digestive treatments completely overlook: small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. SIBO. SIBO is now identified by gastroenterologists as one of the most common causes of chronic bloating, present in up to 30% of adults with irritable bowel syndrome. When bacteria that should live in the large intestine colonize the small intestine, they ferment food as it arrives, producing enormous volumes of gas hours before the food would reach the colon, where fermentation is normal. And here is what modern gastroenterology says. Carvacrol and oregano has documented antimicrobial activity against the bacterial species most associated with SIBO. A clinical study found oregano oil significantly reduced SIBO-related symptoms, including bloating, gas, and abdominal discomfort in patients with confirmed SIBO on hydrogen breath testing. Multiple studies confirm carvacrol is effective against the gram-negative bacteria, including E. coli and Klebsiella, most commonly associated with bacterial overgrowth in the small intestine. The traditional use: oregano used generously in cooking at every meal. Oil of oregano in therapeutic preparations. The biblical Levant's hillside herb that appeared in every meal was continuously suppressing the small intestinal bacterial populations that produce the most persistent and difficult-to-treat bloating. 18. Fenugreek, the biblical seed that feeds the right gut bacteria. Fenugreek appears throughout ancient Near Eastern agricultural and medical records. And for bloating specifically, fenugreek addresses the microbial foundation of digestive health rather than the symptoms. And here is what modern microbiome research says. Galactomannan fiber in fenugreek is one of the most selective prebiotics ever identified, specifically feeding bifidobacterium and lactobacillus populations while not feeding the gas-producing bacteria that cause bloating. This selectivity is what distinguishes fenugreek from generic fiber supplements that increase gas production in sensitive individuals by feeding both beneficial and gas-producing bacteria simultaneously. A randomized controlled trial found fenugreek fiber significantly reduced bloating, flatulence, and abdominal discomfort compared to placebo in adults with irritable bowel syndrome. The specific improvement in gas symptoms without the temporary worsening seen with other fiber interventions was attributed to fenugreek's selective prebiotic profile. The traditional use: fenugreek seeds consumed daily as part of cooking. The ancient world that consumed fenugreek as an ordinary spice was selectively nourishing the gut bacteria that produce anti-inflammatory short-chain fatty acids rather than gas. 19. Aloe Vera juice, the desert plant that heals the leaky gut behind the bloating. Numbers 24:6. Aloe trees planted by the Lord. Aloe has appeared on our skin healing list for its wound-closing compounds. Those same compounds, when consumed internally as inner leaf gel, perform the same wound-closing function inside the gut. And here is what modern gastroenterology says. Assaman in aloe vera inner gel stimulates the repair of intestinal epithelial tight junctions, the microscopic seals between intestinal lining cells that prevent undigested food particles from passing into the bloodstream. When tight junctions are compromised, the condition of intestinal hyperpermeability, food particles trigger systemic immune responses that produce the bloating and food sensitivity that most adults attribute to specific food intolerances. A randomized double-blind trial found aloe vera juice significantly reduced bloating and abdominal discomfort in patients with irritable bowel syndrome after 4 weeks. A separate clinical study confirmed significant reduction in intestinal permeability markers alongside improved digestive symptoms. The traditional use: fresh inner aloe gel consumed as a preparation. The desert plant God planted in the biblical landscape was closing the gut lining gaps that most chronic bloating originates from. 20. The ancient meal pattern, the practice that made every plant work. And here we are at number 20. John 6 verse 35. I'm the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry. The ancient world's relationship with food was not one of anxiety, avoidance, and food fear. It was one of nourishment, community, and the deliberate consumption of food that was prepared to be easily digested. Every meal contained bitter herbs that stimulated digestive secretion. Every meal contained fermented preparations that provided digestive acid and probiotics. Every meal contained spices, cumin, coriander, fennel, ginger, that relaxed the gut, stimulated enzymes, and prevented fermentation. Modern gastroenterology has arrived at the same conclusion through a different route. The FODMAP elimination diet, the most evidence-based dietary intervention for bloating in mainstream gastroenterology, is essentially the elimination of all the processed, fermentable foods that replace the ancient food culture. When those foods are removed and replaced with the whole plants, spices, and bitter preparations of the ancient world consumed, bloating resolves in the majority of patients without any medication. The ancient world did not have IBS, functional dyspepsia, or chronic bloating at the rates the modern world does. Not because their digestive systems were different, because their food was. The spices in every dish, the bitter herbs at every meal, the fermented preparations alongside every main course, the digestive plants consumed so routinely that no one thought of them as medicine. That food culture is teachable. Those plants are available. And the gut that is bloated, uncomfortable, and hypersensitive every single day was not designed to function this way. It was designed to be fed what the ancient world never stopped providing. Drop a comment below.